The Drifter, an America Falls novel. Written by Scott Medbury. Narrated by Mike Manns. Episode 4. Lynch Mob. Chapter 1. Marley stood over Ragland and David with her arms folded. He rolled off his attacker, who moaned and clutched his side. "What's your prob?" It was then he noticed the blood seeping through the pale fingers. Somehow in the struggle, David had been struck by his own knife. The wounded man's eyes bulged when his hand came away covered in blood. "You stabbed me, you bastard!" Marley swore under her breath, and Ragland's head spun. "Marley," interrupted Charlie. "Not yet, Charlie," Marley snapped, kneeling down beside David. "We need to get him to Claire. Can you lift him, Ragland?" Ragland looked around to find David's sidekick Blackbeard had disappeared. "Why not?" he said, feeling slightly peeved at the accusatory look in her eyes. He bent over and helped the wounded man to his feet and put an arm under his shoulders. David screamed and almost ruptured Ragland's eardrums. "Got him," he said, looking at Marley. "This wasn't my fault, you know." "Less talk. We need to go. Charlie, run ahead and prep Claire. This is a nasty one." Despite everything, Ragland would help the bleeding man to Claire so he could be stitched up, but he wasn't doing it for David. That much was certain. He and Marley set off into town, in the direction of Claire's office. The walk, while hampered by David's moaning and squirming, took less time than expected. Within 8 minutes they were at the front door, held ajar by a crimson-faced Claire. Her eyes ran through Ragland like hot daggers, her jaw working overtime. Stepping delicately through the narrow doorway, he carried David through the reception, down the hall, and into Claire's treatment room. There he helped him onto a bed that was already prepared for him. Claire appeared behind him, reaching for her stethoscope and pressing the circular end against David's chest, after she and Marley had removed his shirt. There, for all to see, his stab wound oozed blood. She went to the sink and washed her hands in silence, the room filled only with David's groans, before grabbing a cloth and cleaning his wound with alcohol and covering it in gauze to stop the bleeding. "Marley," Claire called, turning to the doorway where the mare had retreated. "Could you grab me the liquor from the right cupboard, bottom shelf?" "Sure," said Marley, her face as pale as David's. She retrieved a large bottle of overproof rum, still labeled, and handed it over. "That's some of your good stuff there, Claire." "I know, but it's the best stuff to ease the pain quickly." Ragland watched Claire looking for a cup for David to drink from. Already feeling in the way, his thoughts were interrupted by Claire's withering gaze. "You can go. You're no use here." Ragland nodded. "What did Charlie tell you?" "That's your bad fucking news." A pause, still watching the gauze to check for blood. "No, he said it was an accident, but I don't want an excuse. As far as I'm concerned, you're bad news. Please leave. I need to work here." Marley nodded at Ragland, reaching out for his arm. "Come on." As he went through the door, he paused. "Claire, where did Charlie go?" "He went back to the gate," she said. "There's something going on." "Thank you." Back outside in the street with Marley, Ragland noticed how soaked through his shirt was from David's blood. There was no time to change. "I need to get to the gate, Marley." A heavy sigh escaped her lips. "Go see what the fuss is about. Rahul will help you deal with it. We'll deal with this later," she said, then turned and headed back to Claire's door. "Marley." The mare stopped and turned to look at him. "What?" He found he didn't know what to say. He couldn't help but see the disappointment in her face. The woman, compelled to protect her town, had encouraged and given refuge to a stranger, and since then, chaos and danger had followed his every move. "Sorry," he mumbled, then ran off towards the gate. Walking rapidly, arms pumping, Ragland navigated the side streets to the main avenue. There, in the distance, at the main gate, a small crowd had gathered at the perimeter fence. From his left, Simon appeared, walking just as fast and with a towel over his left shoulder. He nodded to Ragland and regarded his bloody clothes when he got close. "Should I ask?" "Best not," Ragland said. "Right." When they arrived, his bloodied clothes a frightening sight for those gathered. A few familiar faces turned to them and called over. One such person, Rahul, charged through the crowd after spotting Ragland's shirt. "The fuck is this, outsider? You bring the cannibals down on us?" he barked, causing a few townsfolk to gasp and murmur. Simon stepped between them. "Steady, Rahul, he's here to help." "My ass! I'll help him right now." Rahul brandished a hammer he'd no doubt carried from his smithy. Ragland couldn't shake the image of a crazy Thor. As sullen and petty as his first impression of Rahul had been, he couldn't deny that he was a menacing figure. "Where are they?" he said to Rahul. "Marley sent me." After glaring at the drifter for a moment longer, the swarthy Rahul nodded over his shoulder to a shelter with a water trough and a few benches. The crowd separated and allowed Ragland through, Simon at his back. Alex, Sang, and Travis were sitting in the shade, still catching their breath and drinking water. Alex stood and stumbled over to Ragland. He looked exhausted. "There's a pack hunting us, at least 20. How'd they spot you?" "We were spying at night. We were careful but missed one of their peripheral guards. Sang wounded him, but he raised the alarm. We made it out of the area okay, but they sent some after us." Ragland swore under his breath. "You should have led them away, kid." Alex lowered his head, and Ragland had to remind himself he was barely into his 20s. "Don't worry about it now. How far behind are they?" "Probably a half hour if we're lucky." "Pack of 20, you say?" Alex nodded. "Shouldn't be too much bother," said Ragland, turning to look for Rahul. "There's something else." The drifter turned back to him. "When we found the main camp, I was able to sneak in when it was dark and get real close to the leader's campfire. It was him and a group of the other Norms. I think they might have been like a council or something." "How many?" Ragland interrupted. "In the council, I think." "In the camp." "I didn't count them." "Take a guess." "At least 500, mostly Zoms." Ragland's jaw tightened. "But that's not what I need to tell you. They were talking about hunting down a tall man and the pretty meat bag he took from them." "Kit, and you led them right to us?" he wanted to ask. "How could they know?" he asked instead. Alex shrugged. "Maybe there was one you didn't see when you saved Kit." Ragland didn't think it likely, but there was no other logical explanation. He turned to Simon, who had been watching the interaction with a worried frown. "Can you tell Rahul we need people on the wall with bows and guns ASAP? And someone needs to get word to Marley that we're going to have visitors." "What do you want me to do?" asked Alex. Chapter 2. Barely were the words out of his mouth when the siren split the air for the second time that day. They looked at each other and then moved out from under the cover. Ragland looked up just as Charlie poked his head over the rail. "Strangers, and they don't look friendly. I count 21. "I'm going up," he told Alex. The blacksmith appeared. "Rahul, do you have more bows and people who can shoot them?" "We don't need more," said Rahul, pushing him away from the ladder. "I can shoot, so can Alex. Sang and Charlie and Rufus, too. We have a stash of bows and arrows on the wall. Come on, you two." Ragland waved the hesitant Alex and Sang after the surly blacksmith. "After you." By the time he was to the top of the wall, all 3 men, along with Charlie and his fellow sentry Rufus, had bows drawn and aimed over the wall. Ragland heard harsh laughter and taunting from the pack outside. As he approached the rail, Rahul jabbed a finger at him. "I'm watching you. If you give a signal or say something to your buddies out there, I'll cave your face in." "I don't doubt it, Rahul." 20 yards from the gate, the cannibals were assembled in a group, a rancid gathering of dirty flesh and blackened teeth. They were armed with a variety of spears and clubs. One man stood out from the rest. He was taller and more upright than the Zoms around him, and on his forehead had the livid pink scar tissue of a carved pentagram. But what really set him apart were his eyes. They found Ragland and zeroed in on him with a focus and intelligence that the others did not possess. He smiled, revealing a line of teeth sharpened so they resembled those of a shark. Ragland drew himself to his full height and gestured to the archers either side of him. "Wrong town, friend. Best turn back." The cannibal leader's laugh sounded like gurgled spit. It proved infectious, and the rest of his pack joined in. "No," he said. "I don't think we'll leave just yet. You have something that belongs to us. Where is the pretty piece of meat you stole?" Alex growled, and before anyone could prevent him, he loosed an arrow that embedded itself in the eye of the cannibal shuffling from foot to foot beside the leader. The pale creature spasmed briefly, then fell back, dead. The leader didn't flinch, or in fact even look at his fallen comrade. His smile widened. "Was that meant for me?" he scoffed. "You need some practice, boy." As the cannibals laughed, a furious Alex fumbled for another arrow, but Rahul, apparently satisfied at Ragland's handling of the situation so far, lowered his bow and put a restraining hand on the boy's wrist. Somewhat unnerved at the unafraid complacency of the leader, Ragland hid his disquiet by joining in the laughter. "No, it wasn't meant for you. First was a warning. Second will be final word," he said. To reiterate his message, Rufus, Charlie, and Sang all turned their aim on the leader, pulling their strings taut. The cannibal's smile faltered momentarily before he nodded. "Okay. Well, we'll be back, mister, but your chance to hand over the pretty meat bag is gone," he said, sneering. He made a loud clicking noise with his tongue, and in unison his mates turned and scampered off towards the woods, shrieking, "Meat!" He gave one last smirk at Ragland and turned to follow. When they had all vanished into the undergrowth, Ragland let the bowstring slack and placed it against the rampart. "What now?" Charlie asked as they lowered their bows. The old man looked back into Bakerstown. "This town needs to prepare for a fight. A big one." "A war?" "Yes," Ragland nodded, looking Alex dead in the face. "And I don't think it's ready." "You know nothing about our town," growled Rahul. "Besides, I think they are full of shit. Marley will decide what's best for this town, not you." "Who says there was any cannibals there?" shouted one of the gathered Bakerstown citizens. "Hoax!" screamed another. "I don't trust him. He tried to kill David." A voice of reason challenged them. "I heard him. Only a matter of time before those cannibal fuckers come back. You heard what they did to Kit." Rahul had disappeared when they reached the bottom of the ladder, and now Ragland and Alex fought their way through the crowd. They were accosted by the heavy hands of agitated residents. "What did they look like?" a woman no older than 20 asked Ragland, her face plastered with sweat despite the cold. "Like killers," was all he could say. He raised his arms and fought through the tide to the edge where the shouted questions chased him up the main avenue. Behind him he could hear the booming voices of Alex and Simon, both big enough to hold a few or so back, and to encourage them to go back to what they were doing. Grateful again, he made a beeline back to Claire's. There was only one item on his agenda: speaking to Marley. They had to begin arming the town now. Yesterday. And they would need to bolster their wall defenses, too. Ragland shuddered at the thought of what would happen if they came back in force and breached those gates. He closed his eyes as he walked, pressing his thumb and middle finger into them, a habit he'd developed when he was stressed many years ago. When he blinked back the light, the figure of a girl with long black hair and a splotch of a face as pale as snow rushed towards him. It was Kit, of course. "Oh my God," Kit gasped, her hands going to her mouth, her eyes drawn to his bloodied clothes. "She was right. Oh my God." "No time, kid. Where's Marley?" She's back at the doctor's office with Claire, trying to fix up David. You fucked him up bad. Rahul is there too, but he wouldn't speak in front of me." "Right," he said, breaking into a march. "Hey, wait. You better be careful. They're really pissed with you." Kit followed Ragland back through town to Claire's office, only to learn Marley wasn't there. Claire had shut the door to the treatment room when they arrived, making sure he didn't butt heads with her patient David. She folded her arms. "You need to leave," Claire ordered. "Now." Ragland held up his hands. "Listen, I know I haven't made the best first impression here." "First impression?" she scoffed. "What about a second or a third?" "Claire." "Don't Claire me." She jabbed a finger at him. "I've got a guy in there with a hole in his guts. Just the other night I was sewing your ear back on. We haven't had incidents like this in over a year. Now all this in just a week?" Kit stepped up. "Claire, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for him. We have to listen." "I get it," the medic said, with her arms still crossed. "But it doesn't undo what he's done here." Ragland shook his head. He didn't have the time now to mend this particular bridge. Forget it. Without another word, he left the office, throwing open the door with a little too much force, and disappeared down the street. Ragland, now on autopilot, wandered around Bakerstown thinking over his next moves as he sought out Marley. He couldn't understand why she wasn't actively looking for him. Surely the others had told her about the threat from the cannibals. He had to convince her it was serious. They needed an urgent meeting to arm and prepare the town. Scuffing his boots along a sidewalk some hours later, his eyes cast over the painted facades of old stores and the stencil-covered windows of offices and old cafes now converted or unused, and a feeling of hopelessness came over him. Something in the mood of the town had changed. He saw it on the faces of passers-by. Some looked wary and worried. Others looked fine, happy even, as if they hadn't heard about the events of the morning, or that they didn't matter. It staggered Ragland how something so obviously real could be cast aside by some as a hoax or as something trivial. These people had perhaps had it too easy for too long. Eavesdropping on idle chatter in the streets, he caught snippets of these notions. Squabbles about what happened outside the gates and whether it was exaggerated by the newcomer and the others. Fewer suggesting that perhaps Marley was underestimating the threat or had gone soft in the head. Marley wasn't in her home, and no one he asked had any idea where she was. Ragland decided to head to Simon's. For the first time in an age, he felt like he needed a drink of something stronger than water. Simon slid a cup towards Ragland and filled it up with a dark liquor from the cupboard behind him. Ragland held it up to his nose and took a quick sniff. "It won't kill you," Simon laughed, "but it packs a punch." Ragland raised the cup. "Your health." He swallowed it in one gulp, feeling it run down his esophagus like liquid fire and settle in his stomach, leaving his eyes watering. "Wow," he rasped. "Told you, eh?" said Simon, throwing a dishcloth over his shoulder. He rolled up his sleeves and leaned over the bar, his eyes darting back once or twice to check no one was listening. "You're not mad." Ragland raised an eyebrow and met his gaze. "Never said I was." "But you're feeling it, eh?" "Maybe," he replied and looked over his shoulder. A couple walked by the window, giving him a furtive glance, and quickened their pace. "Word got around that quick, huh?" "About you stabbing David? Oh, yes, sir." "And you still poured me a drink." Simon smirked. "Well, I never took to the guy myself, and I figure there's more to it. Can't see why a man would save a kid, work the fields, only to shank some asshole one fine morning. Unless, of course, you know him from before." Ragland shook his head. "Never met him till I came here." "Well, that settles it then." Simon took out the liquor bottle and poured both Ragland and himself a short measure before twisting shut the bottle cap. "Thanks," Ragland said, and swirled the dark contents pensively. "What about the cannibals? According to some, I'm still in contention for the crazy bastard or biggest liar of the year award." Simon didn't respond right away. He eyed his own drink for a minute. Ragland could practically hear the cogs whirring in his head. "Had the same thoughts myself before they showed up this morning." "Right." "I guess the town needs a wake-up call. Not everyone has it as good as us, right?" Ragland nodded. That much was true. He'd certainly navigated his fair share of ramshackle dwellings and wild settlements on his adventures, places that almost endorsed human suffering. Bakerstown was definitely the gold standard of the settlements he'd come across in the afterdays. His eyes bored back down into his whiskey. Now, with what felt like the town turning against him, he wondered if he'd ever bother with human beings again when he moved on. After all, what had his efforts gained him here except suspicion and an attempt on his life? "Hey, sir, you all right there?" Simon waved a hand in front of Ragland's face. "What? Oh, yeah. Lost in my own head." "So," he said, licking his lips, "what are we toasting to?" Simon raised his cup and clinked it with Ragland's. "To not being crazy bastards." "To not being crazy bastards," he chimed in and swigged the liquor back in one go. Not giving it time to settle, Ragland rose from his stool and threw on his jacket. "Do you have any idea where I might find the mare? I think she's avoiding me." "Try the school," Simon said. "She's there most days at this time." "Thanks. And thanks for the drink. Seems like less and less people here like me every hour that goes by. I appreciate the ones who do." Simon nodded and held out his hand. They shook, and Ragland headed for the door. "Good luck with Marley. You're going to need it if she's decided to go against your advice. The woman can be as stubborn as a mule." "Great," Ragland said, and shut the door on his way out, the winter wind biting at his exposed skin. "Just great." Chapter 3. Ragland knocked on the main door to the schoolhouse, but there was no answer. He could hear the buzz of the children in a room about 30 feet down the hallway, so he followed the noise. He stopped outside the open door and peered in. The pretty Asian woman he'd seen from across the lawn on his first day in Bakerstown was in front of a small class of the local kids, her hand animatedly pointing at the multiplication tables on the blackboard behind her. A sign over the door read Ms. Erica. Remembering Marley had mentioned they let class out at 2 o'clock, he waited patiently for the class to be dismissed. He only had to wait 20 or so minutes, until a chorus of wooden chair legs scraped across the floor and a stampede of hurried feet headed for the door. Ragland stepped to the left as they poured into the hallway. The kids, oblivious to his presence, charged down the hall and into the sunny afternoon. Once he'd sensed the way was clear, he knocked and took a few steps into the classroom. Erica eyed him as she tidied a stack of papers on her desk. "Yes?" Ragland was taken by her green eyes. She stopped what she was doing when he didn't answer right away. "Can I help you?" Sorry, name's Ragland. I figured, she said, turning to the board and beginning to erase the numbers. What can I do for you? A little old for basic math, aren't you? Ragland smirked. I guess I am. I'm looking for Marley. Simon told me she'd be here. Might be, she replied. Then put down the board eraser and started moving around the classroom, tidying the desks of the children. It's urgent I speak to her, Ragland pressed when nothing more was forthcoming. Sensing she could be an asset in influencing a response to the cannibal threat, he took another couple of steps. This town is in trouble. Is that so? Yes. Perhaps you could teach creative writing next week. She grinned at him, her smile pulled extra wide to hammer home the condescension, in case it was missed. Ragland sighed. Clearly he had misjudged her. Please just tell me where she is. No. Someone cleared their throat at the door, and in stepped a portly man Ragland recognized immediately. It was Clint, the other teacher. Clint, said Erica. Perfect timing. Could you show this bearded troublemaker the front door? Ragland recoiled from the insult, puzzled by her passive-aggressive demeanor. Why were these people so defensive? Clint looked Ragland up and down, then waited for him to speak. I'm just looking for Marley, Ragland asked, making it known how frustrated he was. His patience now hung by a thread. It's urgent. Right, Clint replied. What for? Come on, Clint, Erica interrupted, slamming a book down. Can't you see he's trying to cause trouble? Just get him out of here. Clint shrugged and motioned to the door. Best you get going, he said, almost apologetically. Come on. Ragland didn't move. He'd finally had enough. Do you two give a shit about those kids? Don't you dare, Erica snapped, stepping into his personal space. We keep these kids safe from the likes of you. Not for very fucking long, Ragland said. If I don't get Marley to convince you sorry bastards to prepare for an attack, you'll all be dead before Christmas. What? Clint said. Ragland glanced at him. The teacher's head was tilted to the side like a curious dog. Erica rolled her eyes. The cannibal thing? She smirked. They don't have the numbers or the wherewithal to attack us. We're well armed and well protected, and guess what? We've managed for nearly 10 whole years before you came along. Show him out, Clint, please. Ragland shook his head and leaned over Erica. You've all lost it, he growled. A large hand grabbed Ragland by the arm and pulled him back. Come on, Clint said. We don't want any more trouble. More, said Ragland, shaking him off easily. What does that mean? Forget it, the teacher said, his voice quavering. Ragland sensed his fear and knew that trouble meant the incident with David. His reputation had really soured in the space of a few hours, and through no real fault of his own. The people of Bakerstown feared him now. The notion hit him like a freight train. Perhaps that was it. He'd given them focus, a bad guy. Of course, they wouldn't care about the half-believed threat of the cannibals, while a perceived threat was amongst them. It was the drifter they'd welcomed through their gate, who had stabbed one of their own, and who'd now become their villain. Ragland's shoulders slumped, and he allowed Clint to lead him out of the classroom. Halfway down the hallway, their footsteps echoing, Marley's voice called from the other end. Clint? The big teacher stopped, turned Ragland around with him, and called back. There you are, Clint said. He gripped Ragland's arm more tightly, a warning not to try anything. What's going on here? Marley asked, with her hands planted firmly on her hips as she approached the two men. Says he was looking for you. Were you expecting him? Marley's eyes moved between them both, then settled on Ragland. No, but since when does anyone need an appointment to speak to me? And why are you holding him like a naughty child? Let him go, Clint, for God's sake. He dropped Ragland's arm instantly. Sorry, Mayor. He's just been pestering Erica about seeing you. Erica appeared in the classroom doorway behind Marley. I can speak for myself, Clint, she said, arms folded. Marley turned and stepped back to include the teacher in the conversation. She seemed keen to address what had happened. Well? Marley asked. What is the problem? And no bullshit, please. He's stirring up nonsense about the cannibals, Erica said. Came barging in while I was teaching. Rude, undignified, and uncalled for. Mayor, I really must protest. Ragland ground his jaw at the exaggeration. Barging in? What the hell is your problem, lady? This ends here, Erica, Marley said. Now. I'll decide who I want to speak to, not you. Next time someone asks, you pull your head in and call me, okay? I don't need a receptionist. Of course, I didn't mean to, Erica stuttered. I know you didn't, which is why I'm reminding you. She took Ragland's elbow. Let's go for a walk. Marley led him outside into the crisp, bright afternoon. Don't let Erica get to you. She has a little thing for David. Unreciprocated, thankfully for her, but that probably tainted her perception of you a little. They crossed the road to a store opposite the school. Behind the frosted glass, fresh flowers were bunched neatly in colored vases. Outside, in a few wooden baskets and crates, other selections rested in beds of compost and soil. With delicate movements, a young woman with curly brown hair snipped at a few branches and watered the base of others. Marley, with Ragland just behind, stepped onto the sidewalk and bent down to inspect the seasonal flowers. "Casey, you and Fred possess a magic I have yet to find a name for," she marveled. Ragland had to admit the array of vibrant colored flowers did impress. Casey, the woman in the apron Marley had addressed, put down her trowel and responded in an accent so southern it caught Ragland off guard. "That's just what we call God's honest work, Mayor." She laughed and hugged Marley. "How are you? What brings you by today? You didn't kill the violets I gave you, did you?" "Of course not. They're very much alive and well on my dining room table. And still gorgeous. I've come to show my friend here your boutique." Casey looked over at Ragland, then craned her head up to meet his eyes. "My gosh, you sure are a tall one, ain't you?" She held out a dirty hand, all smiles and bright eyes. "Nice to meet you. Name's Joshua Ragland." "Casey Jones," she replied in her southern drawl. "Originally from Mississippi, if you can't tell by my sultry tones. Freddie's in the back there, sorting out the compost." Ragland nodded, noting she hadn't flinched when he'd said his name. "Mind if we go on in and say hello?" Marley asked. "Go ahead," Casey beamed. "It's always mighty nice to see y'all." So they did. Giving her another nod, Ragland followed Marley into the store, the walls stacked high with plant pots and flowers just like the ones outside, a rainbow of color. "Wow," Ragland breathed as he inhaled the fragrances. "I didn't expect this." "Oh, we do just fine in old Bakerstown," a deep voice boomed from somewhere at the back of the shop. Ragland craned his head and spotted a young man with a receding hairline, who was probably no older than 20. He was bent over a plant by the counter. He stood up to greet them, his jeans muddied worse than Casey's. Fred held out a hand. "Nice to meet you," he said to Ragland. "My, you must be the oldest man I've ever seen. No offense. How old are you, if you don't mind me asking?" Marley shook her head. "Really, Fred?" "I'm just asking." "It's fine," Ragland replied, used to being a curiosity to most survivors. "I'm 34. I get it a lot. I was one of the oldest when the virus hit and killed most of the adults off." Fred chortled. "Bet you been asked that a few times since the fall, right?" "Right," Ragland confirmed. "Give or take 1,000. Fred laughed again and rubbed the top of his bald head. "That old and you still have more hair than me." They all laughed. "Anyway," Marley pressed, "it was nice seeing you. Give my love to the kids and I'll see you tonight." "Right you are, Mayor." Fred nodded. Back outside in the street, Marley took Ragland by a few more spots, reminiscent of his first tour of Bakerstown just over a week ago. He waited for her to raise the issue of the cannibals, but finally realized it wasn't going to get discussed if he didn't raise it. By the time they were done, and the sun had sunk into a thick smudge of clouds over the hills to the west, Ragland pulled Marley aside opposite a row of houses at the edge of town. "I don't suppose there was a meaning behind all of that." "Actually," she said, "there was." "Marley, the threat out there is real, and you can't be complacent. I know you love this town, which is why I know you'll protect it. If Bakerstown wants to see another spring, it needs to prepare itself now." The mare's shoulders sagged, making her seem many years older than what she actually was, a girl in her mid-20s. She climbed up onto a nearby fence, sitting on the top and resting her feet on the bottom rail. "We can't, is my point." "What?" he asked as he zipped up his jacket. "You saw them. My people, Bakerstown. Most of them are just good, honest people. We all are. Many of them didn't fight to keep this place. Only a handful of us did, and only we have blood on our hands." Marley looked down and rubbed a thumb across her left palm. Even in the faint torchlight he could see the scar. "We want it kept that way. Many of them have never fought, never taken a life. We can't afford the chaos that hysteria and war panic might bring, especially when many know they can't defend themselves." "But they can!" Ragland shouted. "If they can hold a bow, a club, or a gun, if you still have them, they can fight." "No," she said, tears in her eyes. "They can't. And I won't have them either." Ragland couldn't register the words. It took him a minute to process. "But you'll be slaughtered." "By the words of a few and from a threat unconfirmed," she said and climbed down from the fence. "Let me worry about this town, Joshua. I am its mare, and I'll find a way so that we don't need to fight. Chapter 4. Early winter snow drifted and fluttered down from a steel-gray sky. Ragland, perched against a row of hitching posts, spent the morning after his disappointing conversation with Marley thinking about his next move. Just how could he convince the town to prepare for a fight when the mayor thought there was another way? He had half a mind to call it quits and leave, but he knew he wouldn't. His fingers found the onyx stone on the leather thong around his neck. He surveyed the faces of those walking by, wrapped up to keep warm, their eyes cast to the heavens in wonder at the falling snow. No, he couldn't leave because he'd regret it for the rest of his life. He needed to speak to Alex. Making sure his makeshift poncho was tightened under his chin, he began walking to the gate. Ragland spied the man he was looking for astride a chestnut horse, loping slowly towards him 5 minutes later. It was a beautiful specimen. "Morning." Ragland called up to him on his saddle and nodded. Alex smiled. "Morning, old man," he said with a glint in his eyes. "Snow day happiness? Hey, want to give me a hand?" "Sure thing." Ragland took the reins from Alex, which left him hands free to climb off the saddle and unload the saddlebags. The sleeve of his winter coat rode up, and for the first time Ragland noticed a long scar on his wrist, the rest of it hidden under his shirt sleeve. He didn't want to ask about it just yet, so he steered the horse over to the hitching post and tied it neatly. The horse whickered and bobbed its head. Ragland smiled warmly, reached up with a hand, and rubbed its face a few times. "Gorgeous. Does he have a name?" Alex heaved the saddlebags over his shoulders. "She sure does. Barbara." Ragland raised his eyebrow and then bent over to look under the horse's belly. "I see. Sorry. I guess I thought someone was feeling the cold." Alex chuckled. "So, Barbara, how'd you come up with that?" "Found a stash of comics in the library. Batman comics. Jenny let me have first dibs. Kit's a fan, too. It's kinda how we hit it off. Sorry, I'm, rambling." "Jenny?" Ragland asked. "The chronologist. Keeps inventory of all the—" Ragland nodded, patting Barbara's neck. "I remember now. And why Barbara?" Alex smirked. "Batwoman's alter ego, Barbara Gordon. Couldn't resist." "Sure. So what you got there?" "Oh," he said as he adjusted the weight of the saddlebags again. "Just some food supplies. I'm just dropping them off, and then we'll take Barbara here to the stables. Looks like it'll be snowing on and off now for a while." Ragland looked back up at the sky. "You think?" "Oh, yeah," Alex replied. "We get a lot of snow here quite early. Have done for the last few years." "Does that get difficult? For hunting, I mean?" "Not really. David and Sang are the best hunters and never have a problem. But you've downed one, so who knows?" "About that," Ragland started, but Alex held up a hand. "Listen, it's okay. I know what David's like. If he ended up with a knife in the belly, courtesy of you, then there must have been a good reason for it." Ragland relaxed. Since he first met him at the hunting lodge, Alex had been warm and approachable. He hoped it would help him now when he told him of the idea that had taken root in his mind. "Listen, I wanted to speak with you." Alex frowned. "What about?" "The cannibals. I spoke to Marley, and she's not seeing sense. She doesn't even want to talk about defense." "I know." "Then what's being done about it? Surely enough of you saw what I saw to make it clear you need to do something." Alex slid the saddlebags down on the floor and stood closer to Ragland, to avoid being eavesdropped on by the scattering of townsfolk nearby. "I've been making traps with Sang. We both know what's out there and know we can't convince Marley to fight." "It's not enough," Ragland said without emotion. "I know." "Who else will listen? We need to move fast." "Less than half," Alex replied and looked left and right. "Rahul is always suspicious. Simon has a good head on his shoulders, and you've met Clint." Ragland rolled his eyes. "I have. Not sure about him. A bit too easily bossed around. But what can we do?" "Rally. We need to get the word out. Find others who want to fight, who want to bear arms." "Most people don't know how," he said. "Most came here once the fighting was over. David and his boys can fight, but for obvious reasons I don't think they'll listen to you." "No," said Ragland, hoping that the injury to David would keep him on his back while they worked this out. Ragland kicked a stone down onto the road, disturbing Barbara. He patted her neck again and brushed off the dusting of snow on her mane. "Listen," he said. "Get these supplies off. I'll take Barbara down to the stables and ask around. We need to do something. Where's Kit?" Okay, but be careful. I've heard lots of talk about what happened between you and David, and a lot of it isn't friendly to you. And Kit, she'll be at the farm, I guess. She likes the cold, so she'll be out in it. Crazy, I know." "Okay." Ragland nodded, untying Barbara from the hitching post and turning her around. He had no intention of riding her. Adding suspected horse thievery to the growing list of grievances against him would not help matters. "All right, then," he finished, nodding to Alex. "Round up who you can. Tell them we meet tonight at sunset, right here. Got it?" "Got it." And the two men left, feeling energized by their mission, no matter how futile it seemed. Ragland soon found the stables on the east side of Bakerstown. He couldn't help but be impressed by the recent construction. It was big, a good 50 feet wide and 40 feet high, and didn't have the rickety look that so many of the town's contemporary additions did. At the front were a large set of doors big enough to squeeze a Mack truck through, and on either side of it sheltered storage for hay. Beside one of these storage holds, using the wooden awning to hunker away from the snow, Ragland spied a young kid chewing on a piece of bread, leaning on a shovel. At the sound of Barbara's hooves, the kid turned his head. He was a grubby-looking one, with dirty blonde hair hanging in his eyes. He wore a pair of red overalls and thick winter boots. "How's my girl?" the kid cooed as he waltzed up, taking the reins from Ragland without a word. "She's all right," Ragland decided to reply. "Just handing her over for Alex." "Got you doing errands?" "Just a quick favor." The kid nodded unfazed and patted Barbara on the nose, which she seemed to enjoy. Not wanting to appear rude, Ragland held out his hand. "Ragland, new around here." The kid took it and blinked a few times. "You that guy that tried to kill David?" "Look, kid, if I had tried to kill him, he'd be damn well—" Ragland heard the strident tone in his voice, and his voice trailed off. He took a deep breath. "No, I didn't try to kill him. He's fine. Hopefully he's learned a valuable lesson." "Okay," the kid replied with a shrug. "My name's Jerry Walker, good with the horses." "I can tell." And Ragland meant it. Jerry looked 15 at most. He was short, dirty, and disheveled, but looked extremely at ease with Barbara. "Let's get her in and fed," Jerry announced, and Ragland followed them in. Inside the barn, a series of partitioned stalls ran down either side, filled with hay and horses, including a chestnut with a distinctive white mark on its forehead. He recognized it as David's mount. "Gorgeous, ain't she?" Jerry said to Ragland after he tugged his gaze from the horse. "She is," he replied. "A beauty." "Want to take a horse out?" Jerry asked. Ragland felt weird about the kid's sudden sense of trust. Perhaps he was paranoid, but something about it didn't seem right. "No." "Then what can I do for you? No offense, but if you ain't here for horses, then I need an idea. Sorry." Ragland decided to throw caution to the wind. He had little time, and they'd need every able person ready for when the time came. "Ever seen cannibals outside the walls?" "Nope." Jerry paused. He'd been busy tending to Barbara, who now stood behind a closed gate, nudging at Jerry's hand to feed her. "Heard about them ones at the gate. Is that true?" "It is." "Why, has someone said otherwise?" The kid shrugged as if to suggest the answer to that was obvious. "Half the folks think it was all some prank from Alex. Some say it's a hoax." "Who does?" "I ain't tellin'," said Jerry, turning back to tend to Barbara. Frustrated, Ragland grabbed his shoulder and swung him back around. "Listen, Jerry, this isn't a hoax. The threat out there is real, and no one here is ready to fight. Would you fight if you had to?" Jerry looked up at him with wide, fearful eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if a horde of cannibals came through those gates, would you be ready to fight them?" "You let go of my brother!" A whip-crack of a voice sounded from behind him. Ragland let him go, and when he turned found himself confronted by a feisty young woman of about 20, and behind her a burly man of about the same age, with a well-used baseball bat cradled in his left hand. An older, whippet-thin but tall man of around 24 appeared alongside them with a machete. "I think it's time you left," she said. Ragland eyed off the men who had stepped around her. From their determined faces he could see they were ready to do what they had to do. The girl looked just as determined, and he noticed she also carried a weapon, a knife with a long, thin blade. The corners of his lips curled up. "Maybe there are some ready to fight after all." He nodded and turned back to Jerry. "Whether we want to or not, kid, we get called to fight for those we love. Just like your big sis is doing now. See you around." He left the barn, giving the group a wide berth. "No hard feelings," he said to Jerry's sister. "We were just talking. You should ask him about it." She didn't respond, and he felt her steely gaze pricking at his back all the way back to the road. A few other residents had gathered to Sticky Beak and cast their own looks of judgment Ragland's way. Time, evidently, was not on his side. He felt it. There was growing tension in the air, and most of it felt like it was centered on him. The people of Bakerstown wanted him gone, and maybe as soon as tonight. Chapter 5. "Let me," Ragland said when he came across Claire struggling with a large box of supplies on the sidewalk as the snow fell. "I don't need your help," said Claire, standing up and stretching her lower back. She looked exhausted. "I know," he replied, bending over and hoisting the box into the air, "but I'm giving it anyway. By the desk fine?" Several emotions warred on her face before she finally gave in. "Fine, sure, just by the desk is fine." Smiling at his small victory, he carried the box through the door and into the main reception area, which had already been loaded with a few much smaller boxes and bags of equipment. "Last supply run before the winter?" Claire shrugged, choosing to work some smaller items out of their crates rather than engage in conversation. Ragland didn't give up. "How's David?" "Great, considering you tried to murder him." "Claire, I met him in kind. Had I not, you'd have been burying me 6 feet under." She stopped what she was doing and blew a loose strand of hair from her face. "What?" "You didn't figure to ask him what happened?" "Oh, he told me. I know David's an ass, but a heated argument never warrants a knife to the gut. Never." "Is that what he told you?" Ragland raised an eyebrow, incredulous someone so resourceful and smart could buy into such horse shit. "Sure, I believe him." "Seems he missed out the bit where he broke into the creaky with his buddy and jumped me. You know the knife was his, right?" Claire stopped what she was doing. She had her back to him, so Ragland couldn't gauge by her face what she was thinking. He decided to test her patience. "Do you still have it, the knife?" "It's in my office." She turned and looked up at Ragland as if weighing up his side of the story. Then she frowned and marched down the corridor to her office. He followed. By the time he reached the doorway, Claire had plucked the knife from a drawer. It was still caked in blood, likely put aside after the incident without a second look. The old man leaned against the frame of the doorway and folded his arms. Claire turned the knife over and peered closely at it. "Shit." Ragland stepped into the office, and shaking her head regretfully, she handed the knife to him, handle first. "What is it?" Ragland asked, after turning the knife over and failing to spot anything. "Look at the handle." Ragland looked more closely this time and noticed the vague scratching of 2 letters, D and H. "His initials?" Claire nodded. "David Henderson, full name. No other D.H. in Bakerstown." She sighed. "I owe you an apology." "No, you don't." She looked at him sidelong. "Yes, I do. Don't be an ass. I know when to admit I'm wrong." She took the knife back and tossed it back into the drawer. "Nobody's perfect, Claire, not even me." A smile briefly lit up her features. He had made progress. "But listen," he continued, "I didn't just come here to set the record straight. It's not about whether you like me or not." "Oh, really? Do tell." She narrowed her eyes at Ragland. It struck him then, in the half-light of a lantern on her desk, how pretty she was. Behind her, snowflakes danced past the window, and he wondered briefly if it would be appropriate to tell her what he was thinking. "Not the time," he told himself. "No, I came here because out of everyone I've met so far, you seem to be a voice of reason that Marley might listen to." "This is about the cannibals?" "Yes. She won't fight, or even tell me what she plans if they come back." "If it's true that they'll be back, there's no way we could fight or hold them back. I agree with her." "But do you believe me?" Claire approached Ragland, peering up into his face to search for a hint of a tell. Her blinkered expression told Ragland she couldn't come to a satisfying conclusion. Instead, she stepped back and shrugged. "Honestly, I don't know. I don't know you, and nor does the town." "Does Alex's word count for nothing?" Claire froze, and a look of anger crossed her face. "Really?" she said. "Alex's word? No, it doesn't." "What do you mean?" Ragland asked, genuinely puzzled. "No one's told you? The last time Alex kicked off about a threat from a settlement 2 days' walk away, we sent a scouting party and lost one of them." Her voice cracked on the last word. She turned and pretended to tidy her desk. "So, people don't really trust Alex. Took him a whole year to make it up to Marley and be given the watch command." Ragland felt foolish for having blindly trusted him, and equally terrible knowing he'd been responsible for getting one of their folks killed chasing a shadow. Still, that didn't change anything now. "He's right this time," he said. "Marley will find another way." Ragland sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. "This isn't right," he said. "For Christ's sakes, they've been at the gates and told us they'd be back. I can't believe how many of you are turning a blind eye to this." "Whoa, cowboy, calm down. We just mended a bridge back there." Seeing how worked up he was, she softened her tone. "Fine. Let's take some fresh air and go speak to—" Claire stopped and cocked her head to the side. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Ragland listened intently and heard it too, a low buzz in the distance. A second later, it became clear what the sound was. "Is that people?" he asked. "Sounds like it," she said, "and a lot of them." By the time Claire and Ragland had reached the main avenue, they could see in the distance a large gathering by the school, several dozen at least. some of them holding up torches against the flurry of snow and encroaching twilight. Claire tugged the coat tight around her. "What the hell is this?" "No idea, but isn't that David?" Claire followed Ragland's pointed finger and groaned. "That ass! I told him to rest or he'd open up those stitches. I'll kill him." The pair walked toward the crowd, and as they did, David spotted Ragland and his voice boomed, grabbing the attention of everyone. "There he is!" The mob turned, and almost as one rushed them, angry faces and lunging hands enveloping them. Claire yelled and tried to intervene, but she was tossed aside as they grabbed Ragland. He grappled with a few of the men, trying to pin him down, punching one and elbowing another, but he was quickly overwhelmed and hit in the face and head several times before he was subdued. Kicking and protesting, 5 large men, including 2 he recognized from earlier at the barn, pulled him towards David and held him. David climbed to the top step of the store they were congregated in front of, and gestured they should stand the prisoner on the step below so the mob would see him clearly. "The man of the hour," he declared after a theatrical pause. "A trespasser no longer welcome." "Come on, David," Ragland grumbled, his face aching from the loose fists he'd caught. "Stop this. Where's Marley?" "Where's Marley? Well, Marley don't have the balls to do what's got to be done with you, Ragland. We folk of Bakerstown have had enough, and we've voted, and Marley will have to honor that vote if we value a free world. Do we value a free world?" he shouted to the people, who responded by yelling in agreement. "Let me through," Claire called, struggling through the crowd before drilling the ringleader with a fiery gaze. "David, you idiot! A show of hands is not a vote, and this is just a lynch mob." With a furious gesture, David had Claire grabbed and marched back the way she had come. She kicked and screamed all the way. "You asshole," Ragland said. "Fuck you." David clenched his fist and drove it into the side of Ragland's head, drawing blood at the first punch. The crowd cheered and bayed like animals. Ragland raised his head once it had stopped spinning and spat some of the blood in his mouth onto the dirt. His ears rang, and through the hair hanging over his eyes he saw more people arriving and, encouragingly, they were protesting to the crowd. He saw Alex, Simon, Viola, and a clearly frightened Kit, but the rest were caught up in a frenzy. For now, his would-be saviors were helpless and he was on his own. "Now, as I was saying, we voted and it's a hanging we'll be having today." David basked in the power as the crowd roared, and reached behind him, taking something from Blackbeard. He thrust his hand into the air, and gripped in it was a rope with a hangman's noose. Cheers and baying drowned out the protests of the few in Ragland's corner. The shotgun blast behind the mob sent people scurrying with cries and screams of surprise. Then silence reigned for a few seconds as the crowd parted to allow a stone-faced Marley, shotgun in hand, to pass through. She pumped the shotgun and chambered a new round. "Back off, all of you." From a baying mob to a group of chastened citizens, they obeyed immediately. David lowered the rope, his face red with anger. "Stop, Marley. The town voted. They want him strung up for attempted murder. Look!" David lifted his shirt to show the place where he'd been stabbed. It was a gruesome sight, now weeping fresh blood through rudimentary stitching. There were gasps and angry grumblings as the emotions of the crowd swung back his way. "And by your own knife. I wonder how that happened." All heads turned towards Claire, including Marley's, as the medic shook off the 2 men holding her arms. The cold wind and falling snow were forgotten as they waited for her to say more. She made her way back to the front and stood between Marley and David, her eyes avoiding Ragland altogether. "I saw the markings on the knife, your own blade. Why were you there where he sleeps with your hunting knife?" Murmurs rippled through the townsfolk. Ragland eyed Claire, thankful now that they'd made amends. She may have just saved his life. "It's my property. I always have it on me. I went there to talk." "Enough!" Marley yelled, raising her shotgun but refraining from squeezing the trigger. "This ends now. We did not build this place to act like animals and lynch people, especially a man who saved one of our own." "And tried to kill another," cried someone from the crowd. They were met with shouts of agreement. "Christ, people, were you not listening?" called Claire, but acquiesced to Marley when the mayor held up her hand for silence. "So, you would hang someone without a trial," Marley continued, tipping the cutter hat she wore against the onslaught of snow. "That is not how we do things in Bakerstown. David, I will look further into this, and I better not find out you're lying. Release him." The men holding Ragland glanced at David, who nodded, apparently resigned to the fact his chance to deal with Ragland was lost. And they let him go. The drifter shook them off and stepped off the steps, spitting blood into the dirt and wiping the hair from his face as he joined Marley. For now, at least, she was still their leader. "Gentlemen," he offered, mock saluting to the thugs. David scowled. The mayor spun around, regarding the rest of the mob, shotgun now lowered over the forearm, trigger finger resting outside. "Now get! The show's over, go on!" They dispersed, some looking shamefaced, some looking angry, but none stuck around. Finally, the only people left were he and Marley, David and Blackbeard, and the others who had come to Ragland's defense. "Come on," snapped David to his oafish sidekick. "I've had enough of this shit." "We'll be having more words about this, David," Marley called after him. The man paused and looked back at her, his hands clenched and unclenching. Finally, perhaps thinking better of mouthing off, he spun and walked on. "Thank you all. Things were getting hairy there for a moment." The others closed around him. "No drama, although I'm sure glad Marley came along with her shotgun," Simon said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Goddamn fuckers," said Kit. "You should have finished the job on him." "Settle down, Kit," said Marley, easing her way in front of Ragland. She looked up at him as if trying to find words. They didn't come, but he couldn't mistake the look on her face for anything other than regret. "You want me to leave, don't you?" "I'm sorry, Joshua, I really am. I don't think there's much of a choice," she said, patting his elbow with her free hand. "I need to nip this in the bud to clamp down on any influence that David might have gained from that performance." "No," said Kit and Alex in unison. "It's David who should be banished, not the old man." Ragland put a gentle hand on Kit's shoulder. "It's okay, Kit. Marley's right. Trying to expel David could set something in motion that's more dangerous than the Cannibals right now." He looked at Marley. "I'll leave first thing in the morning." Chapter 6. Kit drew back her foot and kicked the empty can of beans as hard as she could. Ragland watched it sail over the bed and into the wall. "This is bullshit," she cursed as she stomped around the creaky motel. He had been awake when she knocked on his door just as dawn was lighting the eastern sky. And now, after 20 minutes of railing at the unfairness of it all, Ragland caught a glint of sunshine through the window. Morning had arrived, and the people of Bakerstown, except Kit and a handful of others, would not tolerate his stay a moment longer. He finished packing his gear, including a new bow and quiver of arrows that Rahul had sent over the night before. It had surprised him, given their previous encounters, but Marley explained that the smith was no friend of David's. Once he'd been given the full picture by Claire, he had insisted on the parting gift. "Aren't you even going to try and talk her out of it?" "No, kid, this is the best option." Kit huffed and crossed her arms. "I freaking hate them. They're so blind. This town used to be better, Gramps. I promise you it was never like this." "I believe you," he said. "Everyone goes soft with comfort and routine. Gives people like David a chance to thrive. Hopefully Marley deals with them." "Yeah." Ragland donned his thick winter jacket, zipped it up to the throat, and fed his arms through the straps of his backpack. In his left hand, he took his new bow and slipped it onto his left shoulder, leaving both hands free. "How do I look?" he said, grinning. "Well, you know, like the old man who frickin' saved my ass," she said, then turned away abruptly. "You all right, kid?" "Yeah, just like dust in my eyes or something." "Shit." Ragland shook his head. He hated that he had to leave like this, and seeing her get upset hurt him more than he'd like to admit. Reaching up, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "Want to walk with me to the gate?" Kit turned, wiping her left eye and not fooling Ragland for 1 second. "Sure." Taking one last look at the ramshackle hut he'd slept in for less than 2 weeks, Ragland peered about at the emptiness of it. The old bed, the rickety cabinet, and the beaten-up wooden chair. It was cold, musty, and dusty, but he'd grown weirdly fond of his temporary home. "Listen, there's one thing before we set off," Ragland said, clearing his throat. "I want you to have this." The old man untied the worn leather thong hanging around his neck and handed it to Kit. She eyed the onyx pendant, slowly reaching out and grasping it. She stared at it, resting in her palm as if it might come alive. "Your sister's necklace?" "But why?" She looked up at Ragland, eyes wide, searching for the motive that drove him to part with his most precious possession. "I figured there must have been a reason why I've survived for so long in the wild by myself. Figured I had her looking over me." Kit didn't speak. Instead, she held it up close, turning the black stone over in her hands. Then, with care, she tied it around her neck and laid it down on her shirt. The sight made his chest tighten, and unanticipated tears stung his eyes. "Looks good." He coughed into his hand and turned quickly to the door. "Dust?" she asked with a bittersweet smile. "Something like that," he said, and threw the door open. The walk through Bakerstown felt eerie. Some of the townsfolk, those that rose early, stood on the sidewalks and watched silently as he walked by. Ragland and Kit didn't speak, and apart from the crunch of frost on the road, all was silent. The snowfall had stopped overnight, but the altostratus clouds overhead promised a fresh dumping of powder soon. They arrived at the gate to find Marley, with her shotgun in case of trouble, Simon, Viola, Rahul, and even Claire. Rahul busied himself with Charlie to ease open the gates to the wild beyond. With Kit still by his side, Ragland went to Marley and shook her hand. "Keep them safe, Mare." She offered him a weary smile that didn't instill much confidence. "Will do, old man. Thank you again for Kit and for the work you did. I know what happened with David was, well, shit happens, I guess, and you got the raw end of the deal, and I'm sorry." "Forget it. You can't please everyone or be everywhere. It's done." Marley nodded. "Good. Well, I'm glad we met." "Me too," Ragland said, shaking her hand again. "Me too." Ragland continued with the others, getting a laugh from Simon and a warm hug from Viola, who said she didn't give a hoot about what the town thought, and he was always welcome back at the farm. From behind them, Odin appeared at the last moment, throwing his arms around Ragland before ducking away as if burned. "Good work, mister. Come back soon." Viola put an arm around the kid's shoulder, and Ragland ruffled his hair. Next was Simon. "Stay safe," said the big Canadian as he pulled him into a bear hug. Last was Claire, who just a day before would have sent him on his way with a kick in the pants. She stepped forward, took his hand, and stopped suddenly, lowering her head. Ragland, confused and still with her warm, soft hand in his, looked at the others for guidance, awkward and unsure about what to say or do. Finally, lifting her face, Claire wiped a tear from her face and nodded. "Sorry for being so harsh on you, cowboy. Take care." Without another word, she let go and began to walk back into town, with Odin chasing along behind her. What was that about? He only got shrugs and confused looks in reply. Accepting he wouldn't get an answer, Ragland watched her for a few seconds, suddenly wondering what could have been if the circumstances had been different. Burying the thoughts quickly, he adjusted his gear and took one last look up the wide avenue into Bakerstown. In the distance, hunkered but not hiding in the shadow of a building, he saw David. The thug waved a hand, then turned it and flipped him the bird, a faint smile on his face. Ragland ignored the petty gesture from the petty man and turned to the gate. 100 yards away, the wilds of Pennsylvania waited for him. Kit was still with him as he crossed the threshold. "Take care, kid," he said, pulling her into a hug. "I will," she said. Then, as they pulled apart, "You remind her of John." "Who?" he asked. "Claire's man. He died early last year." Something fell into place. "The scouting trip? Alex?" Kit nodded. "He didn't mean to, but it might be why she's, been off with you and stuff." Ragland sighed. "Explains a lot. Well, kid, this is it. Look after yourself, you hear? Keep that onyx safe and it'll do the same for you." "Roger that, Gramps. Try not to pull a muscle or whatever." He winked. "I'll do my best. Say goodbye to Alex. I won't be going past the lodge." Ragland waved to them as the gates slammed shut. Silence and solitude enveloped him. A familiar blanket, but one that felt a lot more threadbare than it ever had before. Turning, he walked off east into the trees, the frostbitten twigs and undergrowth crunching underfoot. This has been The Drifter, an America Falls novel, Episode 4, Lynch Mob. Written by Scott Medbury, narrated by Mike Manns.